Long ago, before the British claimed the vast lands of North America, the land was alive with thriving indigenous societies. The Mississippian cultures built trade networks, the Algonquian and Iroquoian nations nurtured their oral traditions, and the land itself bore the marks of civilizations deeply tied to nature. One fateful day in the late 16th century, the British, inspired by Spanish and Portuguese conquests, cast their gaze westward. Queen Elizabeth I, enticed by stories of untold riches, commissioned voyages across the Atlantic. The dream of new lands and new opportunities set British ships sailing toward an uncertain destiny. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh, a bold and ambitious explorer, obtained a patent to explore and settle in the New World. His men, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, arrived at the outer banks of present-day North Carolina. There, they met the Secretan and CROATOAN tribes. These people, wise in the ways of the land, welcomed the strangers, offering food and guidance. The English, in turn, saw only vast potential, untamed wilderness, and the promise of dominion. Driven by Raleigh's vision, a colony was established in 1587 on Roanoke Island. John White, leading the settlers, dreamed of a thriving English town, but survival proved harsh, and tensions with the indigenous peoples grew. As their resources dwindled, the settlers grew desperate. White returned to England for aid, but war with Spain delayed his return. By the time he reached Roanoke in 1590, he found only emptiness. The word CROATOAN was carved into a post, and the settlers were gone. Had they joined the local tribes, or perished in the wilderness? The question lingers to this day, but the British did not abandon their dream. In 1607, the Virginia Company sent another group of settlers to the Chesapeake Bay. They founded Jamestown, their first permanent colony, under the leadership of Captain John Smith. Yet, the land was not theirs alone. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, had lived there for generations. At first, the Powhatan watched the newcomers with wary curiosity. They traded corn, providing much-needed sustenance. But the English, unprepared for the harsh land, suffered through a brutal winter, the starving time. As hunger gnawed at their spirits, they turned on their indigenous neighbors, raiding their stores. What had begun as wary peace dissolved into conflict, skirmishes breaking out across the land. The British presence in North America was now undeniable. Their survival teetered on the edge of war and dependence on the indigenous peoples. As cultures clashed and survival dictated action, the stage was set for a story of conquest, resistance, and an unfolding history that would shape America's destiny. The fledgling settlement of Jamestown clung to life through sheer determination and the arrival of new settlers. By 1610, the colony had nearly perished, but the timely arrival of Lord de la Warr brought fresh supplies and military discipline. The British tightened their grip on the land, but the Powhatan Confederacy would not submit so easily. Tensions boiled over into outright war. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1610 to 1614, saw brutal raids and retaliations. The English, wielding steel weapons and European tactics, devastated Powhatan villages, while the indigenous warriors fought fiercely to protect their homeland. The conflict only ended with the marriage of Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's daughter, to the Englishman John Rolfe. This uneasy peace, however, was short-lived. Rolfe introduced a new crop to Virginia, tobacco. This golden weed quickly transformed Jamestown from a struggling outpost into a lucrative colony. With tobacco fields expanding, the English demanded more land, pushing deeper into Powhatan territory. The fragile peace shattered in 1622 when Chief Opechancanough, Powhatan's successor, launched a coordinated attack on the settlers, killing hundreds. The English retaliated with equal ferocity, leading to decades of bloodshed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Britain's ambitions grew. King James I granted charters for further colonization, and new colonies, such as Plymouth in 1620 and Massachusetts Bay in 1630, began to take root. These Puritan settlers, unlike the profit-driven Virginians, sought religious freedom and viewed the indigenous peoples as both obstacles and potential converts. In the cold New England winters, the Wampanoag people, led by Chief Massasoit, formed a fragile alliance with the Pilgrims, aiding them through their first harsh year. The famed First Thanksgiving of 1621 symbolized this temporary truce. But as more settlers arrived, land disputes and cultural misunderstandings festered. By the 1630s, the Pequot War erupted in New England as the powerful Pequot tribe resisted colonial encroachment. In a grim display of military dominance, English forces, allied with rival native groups, massacred entire Pequot villages. The survivors were enslaved or driven from their lands, signaling a brutal new phase in English expansion. As the colonies grew, so too did the tensions. Native resistance hardened, and the British, seeing the land as their divine right, pressed ever forward. The seeds of future conflicts were sown, and the struggle for control of North America was far from over. By the mid-17th century, British colonies had begun to solidify their presence in North America. The growing settlements in Virginia, New England, and the Carolinas expanded westward, increasingly encroaching on indigenous territories. The uneasy alliances between Native Americans and settlers began to fracture under the weight of continued land seizures and cultural clashes. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, became one of the most devastating conflicts in colonial America. Metacom, also known as King Philip, led the Wampanoag and their allies in a desperate attempt to push back against English expansion. The war left thousands dead on both sides and marked a turning point in native resistance. In its aftermath, indigenous power in New England was permanently weakened, and British dominance grew. Meanwhile, in the South, the institution of slavery began to take root. The demand for labor to fuel the booming tobacco economy led to the transatlantic slave trade becoming deeply entrenched in the colonies. African slaves were brought in increasing numbers, changing the social and economic landscape of America forever. As the 18th century approached, colonial tensions with Britain itself began to simmer. While the colonies prospered, they also grew more independent in spirit. Trade restrictions, heavy taxation, and British governance fueled a growing sense of dissatisfaction. The seeds of revolution were beginning to take root. The British presence in North America had transformed from a tenuous foothold into a sprawling colonial empire. But with expansion came resistance, and the struggle for control, both against the indigenous peoples and within the colonies themselves, was far from over. The echoes of these early conflicts would resonate through the centuries, shaping the birth of a new nation.